Okay, we are recording. So thank you very much for joining us. We are here with Anthony Blackshaw from Blackshaw Management Consulting. He's going to talk to us a little bit about officer PDRs and training reviews they've done over the last year and the themes that he has found within them. Anthony, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, John. Thanks very much. Welcome, everybody. I hope that's the title slide. I hope everybody, this is the session that everyone was hoping it was going to be. So we're going to go through the presentation, and then there will be a chance at the end for you to ask questions. Because of the way it's set up, if you could just make sure you've got your questions ready, and you will be able to type those in at the end. I should introduce myself. As John said, my name's Anthony Blackshaw, and I'm the Managing Director of Blackshaw Management Consulting. But I've been a creature of student unions for nearly 35 years. I was a sabbatical officer in 1986-7. I've been a chief exec in, including interims, 13 student unions in the last 25 years. And I've been running Blackshaw Management Consulting, working with officer teams, management teams, boards of trustees and student unions for the last 10 years. We have been working with the officer PDRs for about 20 years. I was a recipient of PDRs for 10 years and have been giving feedback to officers and staff for the last 10. And we took over complete operation as a business this last year. So today, the session is looking at, as John said, to look at very quickly what PDR is for those people who haven't seen PDR before, and then to focus on the themes that we've identified from this year's results. So what is Pdr360? It is an online, it's an entirely online questionnaire which provides those opportunities as on the screen about getting feedback from the widest range of people that you interact with as an officer or as a staff member or a CEO. There are 3 separate PDR questionnaires. It provides qualitative and quantitative feedback to identify strengths and potential development needs. And then once the report is produced, we then provide facilitated sessions. These used to be face-to-face, but as you can imagine, since March, they have been entirely online, and we are planning on those being entirely online for the foreseeable future. And by having facilitated feedback, we're able to help people to get a sense of what they're seeing in the report and to produce a short action plan, which enables them to maximize the benefits from the report. It's made up of 40 questions, so you answer 40 questions yourself, and all of the respondents answer 40 questions, and they are split into 10 competency areas listed there. The way it works then is that the report is produced, which breaks down the scores that people gave you by those competencies. So they're produced in a graphical form. We'll give an example here of one of the graphs. Is teamwork orientation. It's a fairly typical graph for an officer, and the statements under the graph show the questions that were asked, and the scores therefore for which people gave that respondent for that category. Then there's a page after the competencies where all the scores that everyone is given are ranked from the highest down to the lowest. This, I have to say, this example that we use is very naughty. It's very, very rare for as many of the items to go down as low as they do here, down at 1.8. It's just to show how the development areas, how it works, so that you can see the areas of strength, real strength in green, competence areas in yellow, and then the potential development areas in orange. Obviously, in the real report, that's all 40 of the statements from top to bottom. And then finally, the stuff that everybody wants to turn immediately to, which is the written comments that everybody puts. And we've given some examples here for a fictitious officer called Pat President. What are the key strengths? What are the key development needs, and any other comments that people want to write about you? As you can imagine, because the number of respondents can be as high as 15 or even higher, sometimes these can be pages and pages of really fantastic, warm comments, and it does tend to leave people feeling rather touched, I think, by the comments that their colleagues make. But obviously, we also focus on the development needs to help officers really get a sense of what it is that they might work on more closely. It is important to say just that the questions focus very much on behaviours and skills in a workplace environment. It is not really focused on being a sabbatical officer. It's focused on being part of a team, working alongside others, working in a working environment, the way that you respond to stress, the way you communicate with people, etc. And therefore is extremely transferable to life beyond your time as an officer. So that's as I said in the blurb, it was going to be a whistle-stop tour through there. If people want to know more about it, then they can contact us directly, and we'd be very happy to give more details. But what we're really focusing on, what the session is really about today, is the results that we got from the year that we've just finished. The results that the surveys tend to be done between the feedback tends to be done between December and March, and in fact we completed the almost all of the feedback immediately just before we went into lockdown. I think we've done another 10 since lockdown. That means that people are completing questionnaires on your behalf from October at the earliest. Most answer the questionnaire in December, and then we do feedback in January and February. Some are later, some are earlier. So it's worth bearing it in mind. It's typically about halfway through an officer's year when those results come out. And it gives time. It gives about 6 months then for officers to think about working on some of the things that come up in the action plan. So just a quick, in terms of numbers, in terms of where does this come from? This year we did 28 student unions and associations in Scotland, ranging from, I think, Plymouth to Inverness, which is just about as far away from each other as it's possible to get and still be in the UK. And we have across the widest, I think possibly the widest possible diversity of institutions, which gives a real picture as to what's going on out there. This year we did reviews for 130 officers. It's worth just saying that it's worth just noting in passing that actually we would have done 135, but there were 5 officers who originally were signed up but had dropped out before feedback was given. That varies year to year. Some years no one drops out, other years it's quite high. Obviously we always hope that an officer that starts the year will make it to the end of the year. So yeah, it's worth just commenting on that. So in terms of the major themes from the year, just in terms of methodology, it's quite difficult when you're looking at 130 reports to be entirely statistically led in terms of what the key themes are. So I caveat what I'm about to say, that there is a certain amount of subjectivity in identifying what the themes are, but and particularly when you're looking at potentially hundreds of pages of in total of written comments and submissions to build up a picture. But I hope that the picture that emerges from the from these themes would be recognizable to a number of officer teams and indeed staff teams supporting those officers. The first one, communication. It's one of the competency areas, but actually the themes that emerged from the reports this year were across a wider gamut than we cover just in the communication. Just in the communication competency. So this broke down into a number of things. Communication with the rest of the officer team was one of the highlights. It is interesting to see that, and I think it's worth commenting on now, that actually making time for social interaction with the team was one of the areas where people recognized that they had allowed that to slip. And of course, it's worth saying that was prior to March. Now, social interaction gets misunderstood. This does not mean going out partying necessarily or going out, taking part in organized fun and group activity. It's just a recognition that officer teams need to bond and need to spend time building those social bonds and building social capital with each other, because it's such a high pressure job and environment that need to have that bond that is more than just what you are in the office is really important. We're too early to know what the impact of lockdown is going to have been in terms of team dynamics. But I think it's safe to say that the anecdotal evidence, and indeed talking to the officer teams that I've spoken to during lockdown, actually there is some evidence to suggest that the ability to see these things as slightly more social has been strengthened, not weakened, which is perhaps paradoxical given the nature of it. Just, I mean, as a side thought, one of the things that has changed, of course, one of the things that changes that social thing is actually we're seeing people in their home environment. We're not just seeing people in an office, and it may be that is part of it, that we feel more relaxed and we feel more let in to other people's lives, and therefore the ability to see it as an actual social interaction rather than just work is heightened. I'm not sure. One of the negatives, one of the biggest negatives from the team communications, though, was that team meetings, officer team meetings in a lot of unions had slipped quite significantly. In other words, we set off with the year with high ambitions and high expectations of meeting every week and setting the time. And then for whatever reason, individuals not making it, the team not making and not committing to it. We know from a senior manager perspective that if we don't make that time and make sure that those meetings happen, they don't have to be lengthy. It's just about actually making sure that there is a formalized contact. We talk about officer teams, of course. A lot of the time officers are out doing individual portfolio work, and so that need to come together and just remind each other what you're doing and what you're working on is really important. And it was a big feature of the year that it felt like something for this year, more than some of the previous years that we've done, that those meetings have not been happening as much. So hopefully more unions will pick up from that, and then hopefully this year, as a result of the PDRs, some of those have been picked up. Communication with staff. This is a theme that emerges pretty much every year. The theme this year was, the key theme this year was a sense that in a lot of unions there was a feeling from officers that senior staff were not necessarily as engaged with the officer key priorities as the officers had been led to expect when they came into office. Now, some of this is about expectation and about setting appropriate expectations, because the work of any senior management team is set. There is work that the senior management team has to do, and not everything can be about the priorities of the officers. But we, as a student union, any student union senior manager will say our job is to ensure that at least the key priorities that are set by the officers at the start of the year are supported and committed to by the union, and therefore by that senior management team across the year. So I hope that as a result of the feedback that we were able to give officers this year, that they went out and went knocking on doors, or indeed not physical doors anymore, but went actually calling on senior managers to make sure that those key priorities got re-engaged with. And I hope that some of the unions that we fed back to in terms of those key priorities understood that perhaps in some cases they had not been shown and not been seen to engage with the officers' priorities as much as they should have. But the kind of flip side of that is officers then talking about finding it potentially very difficult to ask for help from those same senior managers. And of course, that is the other side of this piece, because if you can't ask for help, then it will often be that you're sitting there frustrated as officers that you're not getting the support that you need. And it can't always be it isn't always possible for senior managers to be thinking, oh, I must pick up on that objective. And even if they are, actually, they may not pick up. They may not have the time. They may absolutely say, we must do that. It's the most important thing, that we must pick up on that officer objective. And then 38 emails later, it's not the top priority anymore. So we know that officers find it hard to ask for help, and we'll come back to that at the end of this presentation when we talk about something that came through with the skills audit, which I'll discuss in a little while. So those two, in terms of with staff, I think are really key. And then in bold, because of course it is the one that really matters, with the membership, both digitally and face-to-face. It's the crucial role of a sabbatical officer team, of course, to be able to be aware of what's going on and what the needs of the membership are, and to hear that and to engage with them and both communicate what the union is doing on behalf of the students, but also to communicate and get feedback from students about what's going on, so that they have that knowledge. What's really pleasing, and you'll see that under the trends later, is that for a number of years now, in the PDRs, it's been staff who have commented that officers weren't getting out of the office enough. What was really pleasing this year was that officers were reporting that they weren't getting out of the office enough, and weren't engaging directly with students, even if they were in the office. I think we've been talking with other senior managers, with chief executives in the last couple of weeks about how we might maximize the benefit and the positives that have come from the new ways of working that we're operating under in lockdown, where some of those communication tools that perhaps we have not embraced as readily and as early as other sectors could be embraced, and we've had to embrace them during lockdown to make sure we don't lose that advantage. And I think a big part of that is about engaging directly with the membership. And it's clear that officers at the moment really have a real appetite for it and are missing it, not just since lockdown, but before that they were missing it. So that's a really pleasing development. The second key theme that came out was about organisation and time management. Time management comes up for officer teams and has come up across the whole of the 20 years that I've been involved in PDRs. It has changed in a way, and we'll talk about that as well. It's the biggest thing now. It's about the complexity of calendar juggling. It's about just how packed officers' calendars are getting. If for many officers, this is the first job of this type that they have done, and I think we often, and I know that I'm guilty of this as well, we slip into the habit of thinking that because officers will be digitally native and be much more used to handling technology, that actually they don't need to have specific training on things like email packages that we might be using, or indeed skill development on email handling, meeting handling, calendar management. Senior managers have got years of extra experience, and we still get it wrong and mess up. But it was really telling this year that the change, it wasn't about being late and missing meetings. Of course, that still comes up. It's inevitable. I think when you're talking about officers who have just transitioned from being students, but also because being late for meetings when your calendar is rammed is unfortunately an inevitability. And I think the message to senior managers and others that people interact with officers is that just allowing other people to populate people's diaries without there being some rules will present in problems. And some skills for officers in terms of handling their week and looking ahead and spotting where potential problems can come up so that they can flag them up before they happen would avoid a lot of disappointment from key meetings. So yeah, that is a change and we know from our own experience that the calendars are just getting busier and busier. Officers reported and other respondents reported that not surprisingly, given that many officers are at the start of their careers, and it's lack of delegation skills. And I would link this back to the failure to ask for help. This sense that I was elected to do a job, to be a leader in the organisation. I've got my manifesto pledges, and I'm going to get on and complete them. The need to make sure that people are getting all of the support they need from the staff team, so that more can be achieved, more success can be achieved, and it's training, and it's working with officers to help them develop those delegation skills that will be of enormous use to them beyond their time in office, but of course will also benefit the organisation whilst that development is going on. Those two stood out as the principal themes. We have two other areas, two other themes that came through. Project planning. In my view, it's an essential part of any officer's armory and arsenal to have the ability to, if not to project plan themselves, but to know that other people are project planning. You should complete, by the time you completed a year in office, you ought to have a sense of project planning and what is involved in it, and and basic skills for it. But staff should be supporting you in producing project plans to go with your objectives, and we try and do that. But it is clear that it has not always been a focus during induction and training over the summer. The reason it's so important is obvious to those of us who've been around for working with officer teams for some time, which is that's the development of delegation skills comes from a recognition of those people who are working on your team on a particular project. And so you can combine all of those things. And if there's a decent project plan in place for your project, then your campaign will be far more successful. The impact that you have on students' lives will be far more successful, and you'll get those outcomes with university senior management that don't happen just by chance. So it really, I would ask senior management teams and training and development teams to look and make sure that your induction program includes some project planning training. And then resilience. Resilience has featured in PDRs for staff and officers. It had reached quite alarming levels for what was obviously stress and the complexities and the handling of pressure. I'm pleased to say it is still an issue, but it is more understood, and people are sharing those things better. It appears they're sharing those things within their unions better than they did, rather than storing them up and making themselves unwell. So there's a lot more talk about it. There's a lot more openness about mental health and well-being issues in general. But we still have a serious problem with people taking on, particularly officers, taking on way too much, not recognizing that there are mechanisms for help, not finding those mechanisms, perhaps not being steered accurately and promptly enough to those areas that they could be getting more help, more support. The reduction of stress. It is a job that should be enjoyable. It is a job. It's a fixed term. It's supposed to be a job that you look back on with and think, I achieved those things and it was enjoyable doing it. Where officers don't have that experience, we have to take some responsibility for that in terms of helping them. What we can't change, and what I can't help with in terms of any of the things that we do in terms of action plans, is simply the fact that the job itself is extraordinarily complex, increasingly complex in modern world, at the job of an officer, and simply keeping up with the pressures of the job and just the flood of information coming in through not just emails but social media, and the need to keep up with all of those media channels is very difficult. We are not, the idea of a job being any sort of a work day for sabbatical officers is really hard to enforce. Those days go on well into the night in many cases, and we have to pick up and make sure officers are supported and protected and have thought about how they might mitigate those stresses themselves. That's a big area. Will continue to be a big area. Lots of unions are doing really good work in this area. One of the questions that we ask in the PDR for officers is what could your organisation do to further help your personal development? And we found this to be very enlightening in terms of the key areas that are being missed for officers. And I hope that this will help unions to address some of those issues themselves. Couple of notes. Many officers left that question blank, just didn't answer it at all. Others stated that they just put not applicable, not a concern. Or in many cases, they actually wrote, yeah, I think we're getting everything we need from the union currently. I hope that any officers here today and watching this subsequently will recognise you're in for a year. CPD, continuous professional development, is a thing. You should be undertaking training. You should be able to say, these are the things I needed to know more about, and I have had training in them. It is a perfectly reasonable. We do that for staff, and it is entirely reasonable that we do it for officers. So I hope that we will reduce the number of officers in future saying that. We're looking for people to actually say what they need so that we can pass that back to the unions. A number of presidents and people fulfilling equivalent roles to presidents identified the fact that they don't tend to receive specific presidential leadership training. And the pressures that are put on that officer in particular, we often have expectations on that role, such as holding the sabbatical team together when it's under enormous stress, and yet that officer is at the same point in their professional career as the rest of the team, and it can often be a very lonely and unfair expectation that they are going to somehow magically mend a team that's struggling. So, and also, of course, that relationship that there's always that sense that the president or the senior officer, whatever it's referred to in your union, has that responsibility for being a point of contact from the board with the chief executive, and that puts enormous pressures on that role as well. And again, I think it's obvious that many officers in that position felt that there was a need for specific training. My experience has been that we are really good at doing team development, really good at working with officers as officers, but we do neglect the recognition of that role we do let those down quite often. So that's worth looking at. There were a number of quite serious issues raised. Officers identifying with particular conditions or disabilities often felt that their specific needs had not been picked up and addressed by the union effectively. We had autism, dyspraxia, ADHD all mentioned in this year's results, and other officers with specific physical difficulties, disabilities, who felt that that the staff teams quite often hadn't been trained or briefed or understood how to deal with some of those disabilities, and actually on occasion made things more difficult for officers rather than easier, which is ultimately our responsibility. What was pleasing was where those issues had been identified, it was really clear that the union had stepped up really quickly and got on with it, and had put people very quickly through very good training, but in external trainers, worked with the officer concerned to identify the way in which that then linked to them personally and individually. And there were some really great success stories across the piece, but it is worth noting that disappointment that staff hadn't been trained. So, if it's fine for an officer to say, I've got ADHD, there's a need then to identify, how do we make sure staff know how to to support that officer in a way that they would wish. That every individual will want a different way, and it's got to be handled very carefully and very sensitively by the union, but it needs to be dealt with. More support for project planning. We talked about that in the earlier section, and working with staff to achieve outcomes. We've already touched on that in the earlier slides. Training and skills analysis. This ended up being a really key area. Lots of officers said it was done, but it was never followed up on, or it was never done. We had gaps. We thought the union would ask us what we needed, and they didn't. As a result of that, we've done some work, and we'll come to that in a little while. And then something that comes up for obvious reasons. Anytime you've got fixed term office, there is going to be a point at which you recognise very early on that people need to be prepared for transitioning into the workplace. We have been notoriously pretty poor at this. The year goes by, we're getting so busy getting ready for the next year coming round, and yet we know that officers are only going to be doing a year or 2 years at most. So any second-year officer, we know they're going to be going into the workplace, and there's a need organisationally and nationally for an improved response to what are we doing? What are we doing about helping people transition into the workplace? Good employers in other sectors do that routinely when people are moving on, and I think we don't come out of that very well just at the minute. So those were the keys from that area. So summarizing the trends, so some of these are definite changes, which is why we put them as trends. As I said, we've covered most of these already. Officers did express the need to talk to students more than they used to, more than they have done in the past. That's really great. Obviously, it's the worry, the concern is that they're in so many university meetings and so many union meetings and so many other meetings that they are hamstrung and prevented from those face-to-face contacts. But I think the desire is clear, and it's easier to work with that now. Time management, said it's more about the stress of the calendar at the minute. Addressing training needs and getting those sorted out in order to help people avoid burnout and withdrawal. It doesn't have to be dropout, but withdrawal from the team, moving off and doing things on their own, officers working on their own. Mentors and coaches. I'm not talking about the paid ones. There are some good thick works going on with paid support, but just things like senior management in universities. Any sabbatical officer who has got a relationship with a senior, if there's a senior manager who they look up to, you'd be amazed how often those people, if you approach them directly and said, would you be prepared to give me some mentoring support, will say yes. We all like to be flattered by the request. There is a gap. Not all student officers are finishing their term with the ability to say that they have made relationships with, they've made good relationships with senior stakeholders that the union has. It shouldn't be a gap. It's a fundamental role. Sabbatical officers are fantastic ambassadors for our student unions, and they are that at a university level. Of course, presidents and academic officers tend to have those interactions through committees, but it's that out of committee interaction that matters, and every officer can take part in that and make those relationships and beyond into the community. So there are, certainly for our welfare and E&D officers, there are loads of opportunities to get out into councils and the like, and to make those networks. And there is still work to be done, making officers aware that they can be developed during their term of office, and making sure that they understand that it's valuable not just for them whilst they're in office, but it will serve them in fantastic stead when they leave and stop being sabbatical officers. So we identified the need for skills audits. Now, many unions do skills audits, many don't. We recognise that the PDR process, it linked very nicely. Doing the skills that we have learned using the PDR process would lend itself very nicely to us doing a very easy, low cost. Sorry, that's a bit crass skills audit for unions. So we recognise that it came out from the feedback that it's not been done, and it is a serious frustration for officers that they felt that they were being almost tramlined into what the union was already going to do for induction, regardless of what the gaps were in their skills. We could see that there was that direct link between the PDR process at the middle of the year and identifying gaps that people identified in their knowledge set at the beginning of their term of office. So we developed a questionnaire process for skills and experience audit, and we've done 80 officer reports this year. The way it works, it's 65 questions and 8 areas. Of course, it should be 64, really, but it's never quite as straightforward and as simple to make lots of 8 as you might hope. So those are the 8 areas that we cover. The report links the answers and the rankings to those colours, which makes it easier for officers and development and support teams to see patterns emerging in terms of which areas are particular gaps. So those 8 areas are covered. What have we picked up from this year's? We're just finishing these. We're on the last 8, I think, this week. So general knowledge, the 8th category, was the greatest area for development across the piece. This covers the sort of knowledge that you perhaps might expect that a new officer coming in would be uncomfortable or feel that they perhaps didn't have the knowledge that they really required. So those areas: charity law, employment law, management accounts, financial reports, education legislation. So probably not a surprise, but it is worthwhile seeing that those are the gaps. 3 other responses came up very regularly indeed. So remember, these are the statements, and people have to say whether they agree with them or disagree with them or strongly disagree with them. So these are the statements where people most strongly disagreed with these statements. "I'm good at saying no" was the most common response in unions. So this isn't about individual officers. These are the union team reports that are produced for the sabbatical team in each union. So the highest, so "I am good at saying no." That needs teasing out a little bit more at a local level, and we hope that the development teams and others will work with the officers to work out what the specific saying no is that they're talking about. But it's clearly about taking on too much. We know this from officer feedback in other areas. "I understand performance indicators and how to set them." For me, an officer needs to know not necessarily the jargon in terms of key performance indicators, but how to know how to express what success will look like for them in terms of a campaign. That to me is that is the way that it needs to be. So we talk about it in terms of performance indicators, but it's a gap. And really tellingly, "I am good at asking for help when I need it." And that means we have a responsibility as senior management and all staff to work out how best to make ourselves more available, more open, more receptive to student officers coming and asking for help. There were a couple of others that came up regularly enough to be worthy of comment. Just those 2 that people don't understand the constitution and articles of the union, and they don't understand the strategic plan. Again, not that surprising coming in for officers coming in. It probably reflects a change away from those officers coming through routes where they would have been, for example, on union councils in the past and perhaps would have known the constitution better. But it's areas that I think actually we're certainly in terms of the strategic plan, I think unions are pretty good these days across the piece at inducting people into strategic plans, into the strategic plan, and embracing the flexibility enough to bring officers' objectives within strategic plans. We probably don't do enough work in terms of talking to people about what the articles are actually about. Kind of forget that. We cover it in trustee training, but of course trustee training tends to cover the responsibilities of trustees rather than what the articles tell you. And it is worth having at least a working knowledge of your own articles of association, so that you as officers are the most knowledgeable, that the officers are the most knowledgeable people in the organisation, the most knowledgeable people when they're talking to students about the Constitution. So that, very quickly, in just over 40 minutes, is the themes emerging from PDR and from SEA in its first year. So thank you very much for listening, and I would be taking questions.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Everyone, feel free to either put your hand up and we'll make it so that you can talk, or type your questions in the chat or on the Q&A, and I will put those through to Anthony. I think from my own point of view, there was some incredibly powerful information in there, and it shows the value, I think, of this, the standardized approach for officers. And there are some absolutely some, shall we say, shortcomings with my own approach that has flagged up very clearly to me, and in particular how COVID has meant, you know, I haven't been focusing on support in some of these areas as much as I should. You know, and if these are the results before COVID, I imagine after COVID a lot of these will be even more accentuated. I guess the one question everyone probably asks you, Anthony, is how do you deal with a lot of negative feedback? Because obviously that could be very demoralizing for an officer.
Yeah. The report, of course, is structured in the classic sandwich format for feedback. So all the beautiful positive comments, all the strengths come first. The development needs is the middle section, and then we have other comments, which on the whole tend to be things that people don't have to write, and tend to be rather nice things that people will write. And so they end, so when people leave, the last thing they've seen is some reinforcement of actually some of the things that they're really strong at. I think one of the things that we always try and make clear to officers is that all of those wonderful positive comments that they've read, when they get to the development needs, it's the same people that wrote those wonderful positive comments who have also written the development needs. It's not a different bunch of people who magically, we haven't wheeled in a load of people who are their fans and then a load of people who really don't like them. It's the same people. A report without development needs is worthless, because we want people to work on it. When we get really negative, feedback, it can be very difficult. One thing we've learned is that it says more about the way that the union prepares people for completing the feedback than it does tend to say about the officer. To give an example, if we get really harsh feedback, so if somebody writes, this officer is always late for meetings, it achieves almost nothing, because the officer will say, no, I'm not. And they'll be right, because of course they're not always late for meetings. No one is always late for meetings. Whereas if I actually a softer response saying this officer can sometimes struggle to get to meetings, particularly if they're at 9 o'clock in the morning, that is a much more friendly, much warmer response. And it also enables me and the team, when we're doing feedback, to build on that and to talk to the officer in a way that doesn't make the officer feel defensive about their behaviour. And of course, typically they'd say, "Oh, yeah, that's me. Yeah, I'm not so good at that," and we can work through it. It's very rare these days. I think when we first started this 20 odd years ago, it was quite often that there would be officers and staff who felt that the PDR was an opportunity to unload a load of things that they hadn't said to people. I think we've now stopped that. What we try and say is, you shouldn't put anything in a PDR that you haven't at least tried to raise with the officer at some point. And actually, with a little bit of coaching in each of the unions, we find that the quality of the feedback has improved year on year on year. And consequently, the impact on officers' morale has been constantly improved. It doesn't change that the action plans are really detailed, and that people come away with an action plan knowing that they've got things to change, but it does, at least, I think it's made a major impact on morale. I'm not going to pretend that out of 130, we didn't have certainly 2 or 3 officers that I know of who came back to me and said, "Oh, I'm really struggling. Some of that feedback I was not expecting, and it's really difficult." But they've come back and asked for some more clarification and how they might handle it and how they might deal with it. Of course, we just regard that as part of the service. If somebody's felt like that, we would very happily talk to them again.
Another question for you. Obviously, some large student unions might have whole teams dedicated to officer support. This is such a vital thing. What about small student unions?
Yeah.
I mean, if you have a lot of operational day-to-day responsibility, how can you squeeze in the time to support the officer team?
Yeah. it is tough, and I've worked in very tiny student unions as well as very large ones, and it is a very different experience. I hope that things like one of the things about PDR, you could argue that you could do something like that locally, and there are certainly big unions that do their own things locally because they have the teams. The great thing about PDR is any union of any size can do it, and so you've at least got that element of it done, taken away from you, and therefore the officers get that feedback provided. The skills audit area, again, something like us picking up on that skills audit just to help unions out in a way that takes that pressure away from the local union, so that what they get is a report that's at an extra level without generating a whole lot of work internally. But in terms of supporting the action plans, there's a need, I think, for a recognition that this is a two-way street, and that the officers, I hope that the messages we give to officers is that it isn't waiting for other people to help them out. It's working out how to themselves feel enabled to go and seek the support that they need. We all have pressures on ourselves. In student unions, the officers are so important. They carry so much of the weight and responsibility on their shoulders of the whole organization, its reputation, its external image, and many other things, day-to-day operation, trusteeship, etc. That actually we have to work out how to give them more support. CEOs, it's part of the job. In the tiniest unions, everybody, it's all hands to the pump, and we do know that those things are going to be hard. But I can't. What I'd say is, look for some external help in those areas where it matters. There are people out there who can provide that help in specific areas, whether it be providing officer support through the year, whether it would be coming in and helping you with other areas that are taking up your operational time, so that you can be freed up. Now, I know that there's cost attached to that, but that has to be weighed against the fact that you're not employing staff full time to have to fill those roles, and therefore actually it is ask for help. It's amazing how often you get help from universities and things like that free of charge, and that there are people out there who will come and provide that extra help.
I think on that note as well, we're looking at if one of the things we can do with this studentsunions.co.uk platform is start adding some specific officer training in, because if we're writing off online training for our officers, it might as well be available for all officers. I think the more we can collaborate, the more we can share, hopefully the more time that can save between us. I've got a good question from Matt, who obviously the PDR is quite an individual process, but we're working with officer teams here. Has there any been work done on any correlation with themes with segmentation such as Belbin, Myers-Briggs, or other types?
No, I mean, I am a huge Belbin advocate, as anyone who's done any summer training with me will know. I'm a big fan of it because of its academic underpinning, and it's the fact that it doesn't pigeonhole people easily. It gives people a very clear picture of a breadth of understanding of their work. I think that it would be fascinating to try and tie those things in together. Belbin themselves are doing some longitudinal work currently. The actual Belbin Institute, it's not called the Belbin Institute, but the Belbin organization are doing some work on longitudinal stuff, and they actually recruited some student officers. I haven't actually met any of the officers who have been recruited, so maybe I don't know how I've managed to miss them, but nobody's come forward and said that they've been approached by Belbin. But Belbin assure me that they are working with some officers in student unions to try out some longitudinal Belbin things, and picking up on that and checking then whether or not the behaviours that the Belbin results suggest that people ought to work on in terms of their team gets played out in the greater picture. If I had the time and the money, I would do Belbin with every single officer team in the UK. I think it's at the outset, because it very quickly shows where problems are likely to emerge and helps soften that and helps break down some of those issues. For those of you who don't know, it's worth looking at Belbin online. A Belbin survey can be done online. It's £35 which is an astonishingly cheap. The reports are very good. They are computer generated, but they're very good reports. In terms of Myers-Briggs, I'm not such a fan of Myers-Briggs. And I know lots of people are, so I'm not going to get into a big discussion. I'm sure Matt and I can have that conversation elsewhere. But I think it's a really interesting area. So the answer, it's a long answer to a question to which the answer is effectively no, there hasn't been. But it's always interesting to ask. I always ask people, often ask officers when particular things have come up, if they have done Belbin, with a suggestion to testing out, so they can understand perhaps why some of their why they've exhibited some of their behaviours.
Anthony, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that presentation, for the work you've done with the Officer 365s. Thank you to everyone who's joined us as well. That was incredibly useful. Please spread the word, because the recording of this will be on studentsunions.co.uk, as with all the other sessions. I appreciate people have watched an awful lot of Zoom over the last 5 days. So thank you, everyone, everyone who's been involved. And I hope everyone who has a nice weekend planned with no screen time ahead of them. Thank you so much. And Anthony, thanks again.
John, thank you very much. And thanks everybody for coming on a Friday afternoon. Thank you.
Bye all. Bye.